As we begin year 2, we'll have a conversation with not only 2 of the world's top psychological health and safety experts, but 2 of our first guests and supporters on this anniversary episode of the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast.
From Flourish DX, this is the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. As workplace mental health has become a global priority, there's a greater focus on addressing psychosocial hazards. Each episode, we look at psychological safety from an occupational health and safety perspective. Let's talk Psych Health and Safety.
Welcome to this week's Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. I'm your host, Dr. I. David Daniels, and I want to thank you for tuning in. Each week, we seek to increase awareness of the importance of psychological health and safety by learning from the lived experiences, research, and expertise of our guests, and advocating strategies to reduce harm and minimize vulnerability to psychosocial hazards in the American workplace. Well, folks, this episode marks the first anniversary of the launch of the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast, and I thought it would be really neat to go back in the Wayback Machine in terms of guests, but also reach into the future at the same time. So it's, just how the way the globe is set up. When I talk to my friends in Australia, I'm literally talking to people in the future. But we're going to talk a little bit about what the last year has been like, and just do a little bit of reminiscing. There are some things about this that it's difficult to share with people who don't, have a podcast. And so I get to talk to folks who do this all the time. And so the way this will go a little bit is I'll do a few introductions, and then we'll kind of do a little bit of back and forth and have the overwatchers of this entire process talk to me a little bit about what it's been. And then I've got some curiosities and some questions for them. But I have to start it the way I start these podcasts and have for the last year, by asking this question. And a little bit about the reason why I ask this question in this way is that people are much more than just their names and their occupations and, even how they're feeling at the time. And I like to give people an opportunity to share whatever they want. I can read folks' resumes, and in both of these folks' case, I could be reading for the entire hour about what they've both been able to accomplish, both professionally and individually. But, I thought I'd do like I do for everybody and have them introduce themselves. So first up, who is Joelle Mitchell?
David, I remember the first time you asked this question, and I think I said something like that was a interesting question to ask of a psychologist, because we could give you all sorts of answers there. So I guess from a professional perspective, I'm an organizational psychologist. I am currently employed as the global head of psychological health and safety with Flourish DX. I'm also the co-host of the Psych Health and Safety podcast, the OG Psych Health and Safety podcast.
Absolutely.
My background is heavily in safety and risk management, and prior to coming here, I was with the regulator for the offshore petroleum industry here in Australia. They're called NOPSEMA. I was with them for 9 years. And that gave me a really solid grounding in how different organisations manage really major accident risk. And offshore petroleum is a really, a critical hazard type of an environment. You're just, on an island built out of steel sitting on top of an open well of hydrocarbons. So it's a pretty hazardous environment out there. And, critical risk management is core to their ability to be able to work and work effectively, successfully, productively and safely. In that 9 years there, I really learnt an enormous amount about risk management and working with the inspectors there as well with such a range of backgrounds and expertise. I really learnt so much in my time there, and I'm really glad to be able to take that learning about, I guess, more complex approaches to traditional health and safety management from, I guess, a physical health and safety perspective, and be able to look at how we can apply those to a psychological health and safety perspective in the role that I'm currently doing.
Sure. Absolutely. Wow. I don't think I remember that story if you shared it before. It's just good to get the recap. I have a friend that actually does occupational health and safety offshore, and there's some very interesting stories that I'm sure that you could share. So, wow. Anyway, before we get too deep into that one, so who is Jason Van Schie?
I am, I guess, a very busy father. I come to work on a Monday to relax after probably spending the whole weekend watching basketball games. So come from a very active family, if you like.
That's basketball games in person that his children are playing, not basketball games on the TV.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Although I did watch the Heat Nuggets on the weekend. Yeah. Pretty busy personally, and then professionally, probably just as busy. So, I guess my background, like Joelle, is organisational psychology. I'm hoping shortly she'll be able to supervise me for my professional title with a new grad that we've got coming on board. My background is in human factors. After doing a brief stint in psychometrics, spent about 6 years looking at things like fatigue risk management, alcohol and drugs, fitness for duty, and then started to think about how do we apply the same sort of risk management principles to mental health in the workplace, becoming disenchanted pretty quickly with the inability of resilience training and the like to actually make a dent and lead to the positive outcomes that we want and sustainable outcomes with work and mental health. And looking at the scale of the problem and it being a global problem, really looked at how we could harness technology to be able to achieve that. And so in 2018, we took a traditional consulting business and turned it into a technology business startup, and been building out the tech platform Flourish DX since. And for the last couple of years with Joelle, I've been hosting the podcast, the Psych Health and Safety podcast, to really educate the market about what is this thing called psychosocial risk management, and how do we practically apply it within businesses to protect worker mental health and promote the opportunities for people to flourish. So, that's me in a nutshell, Dave.
Wow. There are so many parallels when I hear you both talk about getting started. And in my case, it's really neat to have folks who have been there and kind of done this. And I actually want to, for our first part of the conversation, is kind of toss the baton to you all, since this is a kind of an anniversary, what's gone on in the last year. I'm honestly interested to get your thoughts about, looking at the podcast from your perspective. And so for those who don't know, and I don't, this isn't the type of show, podcast thing that gets really heavy on the advertising piece, like they typically do here in the U.S. and other places. A lot of folks don't really know how this thing came to be. They don't really know what's behind it. And I try to share, when I get an opportunity to share with people, I go like, this is really easy for me as a host, because there's those folks over in Australia, and I'm simply picking up the ball and trying to have the conversation in the U.S., but they've done all this stuff already. And, but there's a lot of similarities in trying to, in this case, not only try to inform or help people understand the market, it's to understand the problem, period. Because again, in my view, we're a little bit behind. So, I sent some stuff over to you all a little bit earlier, and I want to, I want to sit and learn a little bit about, about how you all do this. So, the baton's yours. I'll be on the other side here for a second.
All right. Well, I'll kick us off. So, David, 1 year into your podcasting journey, can you reflect on what it was like to get started, having never done a podcast before, to sort of where you are now?
It was interesting because it kind of popped up. I mean, honestly, I I saw a live event that you all did probably about 14, 15 months ago. It was the one that talked about ISO 45003. And it was, at the time, I was still doing some of the research for my dissertation. And I was really, I'd never seen anything. I'd heard about the standard a little bit, and I'm not even sure how I found out about the podcast. And I had to get up at, I think it was 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning my time. But it was just really interesting. So I sat in and I listened. And of all the folks on, the person whose accent was the one that was the least was Mary Ann Baton. So I reached out to her because she was closer. She's in Canada. So I reached out to her and says, hey, tell me a little bit about what you all have been doing. And I didn't really even get the connection between what was going on globally. I just, like I said, reach out to somebody close. And she actually suggested that, you should call the folks in Australia. That's, sure. And so I reached out, and I think, Jason and I were having a conversation. It was really the first conversation we had. And toward the end of the conversation, he said, we've been thinking about doing something in the U.S. I don't know if they had just thought about it in the moment or had been thinking about it before, and asked me whether I'd be interested. And, I just said, yeah. I had no idea what I was getting myself into, but it sounded like fun. I'd never necessarily done it before, but I said, sure, give it a try. And that's it. And every episode seems the same way. It always seems like it's the first time. I've still not gotten into it enough to feel like that I've got it down. And it's not, I've been a speaker and I do that type of stuff quite a bit, but this opportunity to just be able to share, and more so be able to learn from other people, and to find out that, as far as I thought we were behind the U.S., there's actually some good things going on. And I think they've increased over the last year. So it's a part of me now. I mean, it's something I really enjoy doing. I really enjoy meeting new people. And as I said, the part that is most encouraging is to see that as far behind as we are. I mean, I got to be honest. But on the other hand, there are some folks who've picked up the baton here who are starting to kind of see what's going on and are doing some research and doing some work and have some experiences that I think that'll get us a little bit further down the road and pretty quickly.
Yeah, and I think that, our experience is certainly one of the benefits of doing this podcast is the variety of people that we get to meet, and I think the quality of conversation that we're able to have with somebody as well. I think the depth that we're able to get to in our discussions is significantly different than what you would get, even if you were attending a conference and listening to somebody give a keynote or a panel session or something like that. We can really delve into some very interesting and I guess we can get into the nuance a lot more than we could in a different setting. So I think that's one of the big benefits that I feel that we get from hosting this podcast.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah, I concur with that, and I think that's how I sold you on it, David. There's the ability to do this networking and building up a community of people who are like-minded and are interested and maybe have a fair bit of experience broadly in this area. But that's definitely for us. Yeah. Who wouldn't want to do that, right? I mean, you go to conferences to hear from, leading thinkers in this space. We get the benefit of having those people on the podcast and being able to ask all the follow-up questions that we want.
Right.
It's more
absolutely.
interactive. And then adding them to our network and, they become friends and colleagues in the process,
Absolutely.
Which is fantastic.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, Dave, in your own, I guess this is your 1 year anniversary. So in the first year, what are some of the more exciting or interesting experiences that you've had?
Boy, they're kind of all over the place. One of the interesting parts of this is the fact that when I started off, and I'll be honest about it, I reached out to originally people that I already knew, that I'd met at some point or the other, that I thought had, again, some learned or lived experience, some expertise or some research already, to include, the folks who are running 2 organizations in the country that deal with workplace bullying, and some of my former colleagues from the Fire Rescue Service, and a few folks who do therapy here, folks I've met through other associations and such. And the nice thing about reaching out to people that you already know is it's easy to pick up the conversation. Interestingly, I've also kind of run through all those folks already. And so I've now found myself starting to meet people that I've not met before, but I'm also, there's actually that snowball research. That's a thing. Start with a question, ends up with something else. So I'm starting to learn more about this topic than I had any idea about. Again, I'm an occupational safety and health guy. And I try to tell folks I'm not a mental health professional. I don't know if I even want to be, because I'm finding that the conversation about psychological health and safety has helped me identify that there are a lot of folks, they don't even have the basic stuff down. So they're not going to be able to assess or identify psychosocial hazards because they don't even know what a hazard is. They really don't. Now, they know their profession, whatever that is, but they don't really know that much. And because there's not a regulation or a lot of conversation here, it helps me to have that health and safety conversation that I really want to have. But I have to tell you, there have been some that have been, and some of this might be recency bias, but I've had folks on the podcast or in the conversations share some things, and in some cases of people that I've known before that I didn't know. I mean, I've had a couple of people share their, experiences of considering suicide. I've had people talk about some of the more intimate details of their employment situation. I've had one person tell me, actually a couple of people tell me about the impact of being bullied and mistreated at work so badly that they had a guest who off camera showed me a picture, a current picture and a picture from, not long ago. And they look like the person and their parent, the difference, because of the stress associated with what was going on at work at the time. And those are things that you don't typically have that conversation. Again, Joelle, to your point, you don't have that at a conference. They don't necessarily, you don't get a chance to really dig into that. And those types of stories, I think, are important for those who don't think that psychosocial hazards are a thing, that psychological health and safety is not a thing. It's affecting real people whose lives in some cases are forever changed by the environment that they were in. And I also like to use the analogy about, yoga and fruit bowls aren't going to fix it. They aren't. That's not going to make it better. So, those are just some of the examples. It's sometimes I find myself, it's somewhat therapeutic for me because I have my own experience of being in the workplace and not being treated well. And so sometimes I have to watch myself going like, okay, let's keep the conversation going and not, zone out into therapy or, lean too much into the conversation because sometimes I just like, wow, my compassion starts to come up and I forget that there's another question to ask. So there's lots of those. And it's really been helpful for me, just as a person to be able to have these conversations with other people.
Yeah. That's it, right? You get fascinating discussions with people all the time. We've had people from, leading academics in their area to plumbers, sparkies, and everyone in between, right? So you get to talk to people from all walks of life and their experience either directly in experiencing psychosocial hazards or, trying to understand or manage psychosocial hazards in workplaces. We've been really fortunate to have some serious heavyweights internationally in the space on the podcast. Marianne Baton not only appeared on the podcast, but she also, participated in facilitating the Canadian podcast for a good year. We've had people like Michael Leiter and Kerry Cooper and Tony LaMontagne, people that Joelle and I seriously look up to as people who've been doing this for decades, right, in most instances. So have you had any experiences like that where you've maybe not fanboyed out, but, gone, wow, I can't believe we've got this person on our little podcast and we're talking about something that's really interesting?
Yeah, a couple of those. As I said, I'm an affiliate of an organization called the Workplace Bullying Institute. So workplace bullying in the United States is the psychosocial hazard we have the most data about. And it's because he and his wife, Gary and Ruth Namey, have been studying this for 25 years. And though I knew him, it's, to sit and talk to him specifically, wow. Because first of all, he starts talking about stuff and he rattles off all this research he's been doing for the last quarter century. You go like, huh? Like, okay. Actually, I also had opportunity to have one of the folks that's integral to the Total Worker Health Program at NIOSH. She came on, and again, so we get people from the federal government here. They can actually talk about stuff. That's a whole nother deal. Mm-hmm. And particularly in a situation where, again, we don't have the kind of, legislative infrastructure that you all have. So, and it was also good to hear that they are following what's going on there and in Canada and other places. I think sometimes there's a little bit of jealousy that's, sometimes we're not there, but it's those kinds of people. It's just, it's really interesting just to be able to talk to them for a period of time. And like I said, it really makes me feel like, although we're a little bit behind because of the work that's been done around the world, as we're getting there, I think we can catch up quicker because we're not creating this stuff from scratch. We do have, again, you all in Canada and the UK and others to look at, as opposed to just totally starting from scratch. And in some cases, I believe you all actually had to do it that way.
Well, Adam Grant, if you're listening, the invitation remains open.
Well, I'm hoping we get Christina Maslach on.
Yes.
Michael Lyde has sent me help out with that.
We have actually had some communication with Christina Maslach.
No, we've had some communication with Adam. We just don't know whether he's read it.
It's one-way communication.
Yeah.
I don't think that counts. If he hasn't become aware of it, does that count as communication?
We don't know whether he's become aware of it.
It's true. This is true.
Shredding his cat.
Yeah.
Well, just the courage to be able to reach out to these big timers. It's that says something. It says something. Yeah.
So, David, can you tell us a bit about the occupational safety focus of your podcast? Because, obviously our approach is much more heavily on the psych health and safety side of things. So can you maybe talk a little bit to the differences there?
Well, yeah, that's why I try to be clear that I am not a therapist. I'm not a mental health professional, but I honestly believe that psychosocial hazards, and even my definition in my research is unique, because when I looked out across the world, I found lots of them, but my definition being a psychosocial factor that's perceived or experienced by the individual exposed as a threat to them, that in turn affects their behavior. I say that, I look at that from a health and safety, occupational health and safety perspective. Because we've had, the OSH Act has been around for 52 years in the country, 1,000 or so words. It doesn't necessarily talk about psychosocial or psychological. It actually mentions the word psychological twice, I think, in 19,000 words. So the act really wasn't created to deal with how people feel. It really wasn't. But I think it's about time. And I also believe that because we do have a lot of experience as a country in that, and actually, serious injuries and fatalities and whatnot in this country have decreased significantly since the act was passed. And I think if we, as opposed to trying to get people to see this as something totally different, I just try to describe it as it's another hazard. How do you handle it? Well, how do you handle the other ones? It's not really as complicated sometimes as people want to make it. It is, but the other thing is to get people to see it as a hazard, because so much of this behavior has just been normalized. I mean, there are folks who work on jobs year after year after year, and they just hate them. And sometimes they hate the people they're working with as well. And as a matter of fact, one of the guests I had a financial advisor come on to talk about the connection between financial independence and financial security and psychological health and safety. Because some people, the reason that they have to put up with toxic work environments is the financial condition that they're in. And you could fix this on either end. Either you could try to work on the environment, or you could, create a space for yourself that's a little bit safer financially, so you don't have to put up with that environment and can go work someplace else. So, yeah. And again, that's the area where I feel like I have more background and expertise and that type of thing. So I just try to approach it that way. But again, all of these topics there, I don't believe that anybody necessarily owns this. I don't. I believe that, at least my view, is that psychological health and safety works best when you get leadership and HR people and mental health people and safety people all talking, along the same lines. But no one of them can solve it. There are probably others, but those to me are the four most important roles in an organization to make this thing work. Even if you are the, mental health provider or counselor or what have you, if leadership's not with you, then, it's a lot of talk, but nothing will necessarily happen. So yeah, I figured out about halfway through my fire rescue career that I was really more of a safety guy anyway. So I just try to be myself, do things that are that are natural to me.
Yeah, and I think that approach makes a lot of sense because people's perception of mental health is very much grounded in that something that exists inside people's heads. And so the immediate response from organisations when they start thinking about mental health is to offer more supports to people who are in distress and encourage people into treatment earlier and that sort of thing. But that's all sitting on the right-hand side of the bow tie, if we like. And so, people they've already experienced harm at the point that they're getting into treatment. And, from a physical health and safety perspective, that's the equivalent of having first aiders on site and having an ambulance on call to take you to the trauma surgery instead of putting guarding on your machines. And so what we find is that when we're talking with organisations who have mature safety management systems and we frame it in this way, they understand it a lot quicker than some white-collar organisations who haven't had to grapple with this concept of hazard management in that same way. So that's been an interesting learning for us over that period of time that, those organisations who are used to managing physical health and safety hazards and have done so for a long time, they really do understand that framing. And once we get them thinking about prevention in that way, then they think about, okay, yes, it is about actually the design of work. But it's very much, we know that conditions at work can cause harm to people. That harm can be physical, that harm can be psychological. And we need to make sure that the way that we're designing work is done in such a way that we're reducing the opportunity for harm to occur to people through what they're exposed to at work.
Mm-hmm.
So, Dave, can you tell us a bit about the focus of DE&I relative to the guests on your show?
That was very intentional. It was very intentional. As a matter of fact, as I look at and I have it on my end, so I make sure I'm giving you the facts, that we've had 63 guests in the 51 episodes in the first year. And 48% of them were women or people of color. And that was intentional. And, some of it, is personal. I wanted to make sure that virtually anyone could particularly look at the podcast. I mean, sometimes when people are hearing it, they don't necessarily know the difference. But if they decide to watch on the Flourish DX YouTube page, that they can see themselves and also see that there are, again, lived experience, expertise, and research being done by all kinds of people. And obviously, this country we have a lot of challenges around having systems that work for everybody. I I've come to realize, and I say it often, that every system is perfectly designed to produce whatever it's currently producing. And, back to the OSH Act, when the OSH Act was passed by the 91st Congress, only 2% of the people who were involved in the approval were gender identified as female. So 52 years later, it still says his work and his employment and his, as if there aren't women in the workplace. And that's not to say that their work was bad. It is to say that their work was lacking, and it was lacking the perspective of other people that now we wonder why the system doesn't work. And also, some my own experience and some the research and some my honest beliefs is that we have, as a society, gotten better at not coming to work and physically assaulting people. But and that doesn't happen near as much as, we hear about it and we hear about those examples. But what has not changed is how organizations, how groups of people, and how individuals use psychosocial tools to harm other people. They don't leave physical marks, but they leave emotional ones in some cases that are even worse. And so, again, there's a lot of conversation, again, here in the U.S. about DE&I on both sides. You have some who think it's a ridiculous idea and others who think it's the best thing since sliced bread. But you will never, I don't believe anyone will ever be able to recruit different kinds of people, retain different kinds of people, and without attention to psychological health and safety. I don't think it's possible. As a matter of fact, I've told some, I can solve that problem for you. We can't recruit whoever. People are different. I can solve that problem for you. And it starts with identifying, assessing, and mitigating psychosocial hazards. How about that? Because the reason that people don't approach or don't stay is because they don't feel safe doing so. And sometimes it has nothing to do with the physical environment. You've got many of these organizations, they haven't had a physical injury or fatality ever, or certainly in years, but it doesn't feel right. So that's where I see the connection. And I think it's the opportunity to get people to see. As a matter of fact, I also believe, I'll conclude this, but I also believe it's actually an easier conversation to have is to talk about psychological health and safety as opposed to talking about race and gender and ability and all these other kind of different things. Why not stop the social engineering of trying to change the people and have people believe this and do this and change the environment so all of their differences, everybody can't fit everywhere. Let's be real about that. But if you want people to be a part of whatever it is you're doing, simply create a psychologically healthy and safe environment and they'll stay. So it's a core belief type of thing. And I will tell you again, this last thing, I found that I start to identify that there are certain groups it's more difficult to find. In order to, it's difficult to find other Black men. That's been difficult to find. And it's been difficult to find, a lot of it has to do with just the people that I know in the circles that I run in. So I am continuing to look for Asian guests and indigenous guests because it's just not a community that I'm a part of. So I've had a few. So I continue to try because, again, I just want to make sure that anybody we're having this conversation, that they will see themselves as best as possible.
Hi listeners, Jason here. We hope you're enjoying this latest podcast episode. Now, if you're like Joelle, Alicia and myself and enjoy learning from the best, then the Flourish DX Academy is for you. The Academy includes free e-learning courses on the ISO 45003 standard for psychological health and safety at work, and associated topics such as how to conduct a psychosocial risk assessment and how to create the business case for psych health and safety. All courses feature high-quality videos, downloadable resources, multi-choice questions, and a downloadable training certificate on completion. Take your learning to the next level with all Flourish DX Academy courses included within the Flourish DX mobile app. Select podcast episodes from the Psych Health and Safety podcast and sister podcasts from Canada and the USA are also included. Get started with FlourishDX for free at www.flourishdx.com/get-started. That's www.flourishdx.com/get-started. Now back to this episode.
Yeah, and all credit to you, Dave, for for doing that and having that as a focus of your podcast. It is difficult enough to find people that look like Joelle and myself who actually understand the area. But to find people in minority groups that actually have a good understanding of this area is quite difficult, I'd imagine.
It's worth it.
Yeah, I think in Australia we have a fairly large sort of Southeast Asian immigration cohort that have come through and we do have a fairly strong representation of people from those countries in academia. So I think that we do have quite a number of academics from throughout or who would originate from Southeast Asia or have family.
Yeah, and practitioners that we featured like, Dia
Sure.
Day and Sandra Lamb and people like that. Yeah.
That's right, yeah. So that's probably an easier cohort for us to access.
Yeah.
I don't think we've managed to have a Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander guest on yet, have we?
No, I don't think we have.
We've tried a few.
So when I do work with organizations around this topic in general, it's hard. It's hard. It's hard. It is hard. And on the other hand, again, I honestly believe that we should be more intellectually honest about why we're doing it. Because, I try my best not to do tokenism. I try to get people, again, who have, lived experience, research, or expertise, and just happen to be, these other groups. But, there are those who, when you start having those conversations where are you watering down? No, but there are people out there, just, I have to look for them. And it is difficult. It's difficult, but, this is a guy who used to go into buildings on fire, so I'm okay with doing hard stuff. So, yeah.
I think that the point you make a good point though, that it is, the value of getting the perspectives of different people is, I don't think you can put a number on that or really put a.
That's right.
Yeah. It just reminded me of a conversation I had recently with a client. So for the context of your listeners, David, in Australia, we've recently had some parliamentary inquiries into gender-based violence in the mining industry here in Australia. And the results were really quite awful in the number of women who have experienced sexual assault, sexual violence, harassment, discrimination. I think the severity of experiences were really quite shocking for a lot of people, including the companies that actually operate those mines. And so this client that I was speaking to recently works for a mining operator here in Australia, and she was visiting one of their camps that she hadn't been to, or a section of the camp that she hadn't been to before, and she was with the it might have been the site manager or the sort of lead safety representative on site, and they were walking through this section of the camp, and I'm quoting her directly here, so excuse my language if it offends anybody, but she said, "Oh, it's a bit rapey here, isn't it?" And he was quite shocked, and it hadn't he had never looked at it through a woman's eyes, and sort of thought about, it's actually quite a long walk from the main facilities of camp through quite unlighted areas. It's quite remote, and if you were the only woman staying in that section of the camp, what that would feel like and the risks that would have for your safety, especially since these are not dry camps. So you've got the impact of alcohol happening there, and some people will be on very, very long rosters where they're there for sort of 4 weeks at a time sometimes. And you also get a lot of short-term workers coming through who don't need to sort of stick around and deal with the consequences of their behaviour sometimes. So, yeah, I think that really that's while it's awful, it's a really good example of the utility of having diverse perspectives on the same scenario.
Yes. Yeah. And I, and again, when we have the conversations, I try to focus on the fact, again, it doesn't matter that you have good intent. It matters that you have lack of perspective. That's the issue. Because you're trying to do the right thing, and you're trying to do the right thing that a dude would do. So I think like a man, because I've been raised to gender identify as male, and I accept all the traditional roles and all that type of stuff. And though I consider myself to be an ally, and I actually consider myself to be an accomplice of women, because I was, I have a mom, I have daughters and sisters and a wife and all that. So but I'm not a woman. And if I want to figure out what would feel safe to a woman, I probably should just ask one as opposed to, I think it should be this. Just ask. And that's the qualitative data that organizations need, are simply to ask questions of people that are different from the group who designed it. Because you had a blind spot there. You didn't think about that because it doesn't affect you, but it might affect them. And the other thing is, when you don't do that, you are losing out on talent. You're losing out on opportunity because you didn't design the system to be safe for them.
Yeah, absolutely. Not only the talent that you already have, but also the potential to attract future talent, because you get that reputation as well. Mm-hmm. So last question from us before we throw the baton or the mic back over to you, David. Tell us about the state of psychological health and safety in the US. And you've already sort of alluded to this a little bit.
Yeah, I again, from the start, I have believed that we were a bit behind. And anywhere from 10 to maybe 15 years behind. But I honestly believe, and some of this is because I've had the opportunity to talk to people over the last year, we may not be as far behind as I thought in many areas, because we do have some great academic institutions that are working on various aspects of this. There is some work being done, at the federal level, not as much as I'd certainly like to see. And I've also, so from a safety perspective, people do things because they believe it's the right thing to do ethically, because they think it's going to save money, or because they have to. The have to, if you can get people focused on the first two, maybe we don't necessarily need a regulation, because a regulation isn't the end all be all. And as I found out about these various activities, and the other thing too, so if I was going to fanboy out, I would love to talk to Amy Edmondson about this topic. I would. Now, I did go to Harvard for 3 weeks. I'm technically considered an alum, so maybe I should try to. But her work around psychological safety, and a lot of what I find myself doing is getting people to see the relationship and difference in that topic, because folks are, it's a fad here. Got folks speaking all over psychological safety, and again, fruit bowls and yogurt, and we tap people on the shoulder, and we treat them nice, and it'll be okay. But and even if that is the case, because they don't understand about the psychosocial hazard environment that they place people into, you can get there, but you won't be able to stay there. Even with the same people. So I say all that to say that I do believe that we are making some progress. And honestly, I believe that the culture, the community of people that we're starting to meet suggests that, there's, matter of fact, last episode, I had 3 people on, all based here in the U.S., that had all been intimately involved in 45,003. And again, I didn't know anybody from the U.S. even knew what it was. So again, there are things happening. And I think a year from now, when it's probably has to be a yearly thing at least, that I'll believe that the gap has been closed just a little bit more. So I'm actually hopeful that that we're getting there.
Hopeful is a good place to be.
Yeah. It beats some of the other options. It does. So again, I've heard recently that there was some new legislation passed there in Australia, and I think it was last fall. And can you share a little bit about the impact of that legislation on, on the podcast and the work that you all are doing at Flourish DX? Sure.
I might kick it off and then hand over to our regulation expert in Joelle Mitchell. But this goes all the way back to 2018 in Australia. So we have our Workplace Health and Safety Act of 2011, and that was reviewed in 2018 by a woman known as Marie Boland. And she made 34 recommendations to, modernise the Act and make sure it was working as intended. And out of 34 recommendations, the second one was we need regulations dealing specifically with psychosocial risk. Because I guess it had always been intended that a PCBU, a person conducting a business or undertaking, or an employer, they had an obligation to make sure that the workplace didn't cause harm to people. And by harm, it was always supposed to be around physical harm as well as psychological harm. But many employers didn't read it that way, pleading ignorance. The regulators didn't feel like they had enough to go on in order to enforce it. And so we really needed, more specific regulations that kind of talk to this obligation that employers had. So what we've got now in Australia is, more clarity around the obligations that were always there back from the 2011 Act. But it's much more understandable, for employers and much more enforceable by regulators. But I'll kick over to Joelle and she can actually explain what is required.
Yeah, so I think, our Act sets out general duties of the employer, and those duties, to paraphrase, is to essentially provide and maintain a workplace that is safe and without risk to health, so far as is reasonably practicable. So that's a very broad duty. And then there are sort of other general duties that give a little bit more prescription around the different areas that you need to think about, including things like workforce consultation, having safe systems of work, those types of things, but they are very broad. Then the regulations that sort of sit beneath the Act give greater detail to certain types of hazards around how duty holders should, or the steps that they should take to manage these different types of hazards. So we'll have regulations around, managing dust, for example, as a hazard. And so psychosocial hazards have been added in there as a particular sub-hazard. There's also a general regulation about the approach that organisations need to take to hazard management in general, which is you need to identify hazards, you need to put controls in place to, reduce the risk associated with those hazards, you need to monitor the effectiveness of those controls, and you need to revise your risk assessment in response to certain events or triggers. And so the psychosocial regulations largely say you need to treat psychosocial hazards the same way that you treat your other hazards. Identify what they are, what are your reasonably foreseeable hazards, put controls in place, monitor their effectiveness, and revisit your risk assessment as and when necessary. What our regulations also do is, I think, recognise the way that psychosocial hazards are unique from a lot of physical health and safety hazards, in that a lot of them are around exposure. So in some ways there are some health hazards, that are similar to that. And so what our regulations require is that when you're thinking about control measures, you need to think about the severity, frequency and duration of hazard exposure, and also the way that psychosocial hazards combine, because we know that they don't operate independently of each other. They do collaborate and collude. For example, if we were to take something like work overload or high workload, if high workload is combined with high autonomy and good supervisor support, along with interpersonal factors like a preference for high workload and feeling like that's the type of work environment that you want to be in, then that's actually a recipe for flourishing. So the high workload on its own isn't inherently a hazard. It interacts with the other situations at work as well as your personal preferences. We also know that high workload, if it's combined with low autonomy and a workplace incivility, well, that can be a recipe for burnout. So we really do need to think about, the way that those hazards interact with each other to create harm. And then also, that exposure piece, something like workplace violence, that can be a very high impact from a single exposure. But if we talk about something like workplace incivility, one experience of workplace incivility, that's unlikely to cause harm. But if you've got, if you're working in that environment for years on years, that erodes over time. So that's actually that cumulative impact over time. So that's why we need to think about severity, frequency and duration of hazard exposure to give us an indication of what's likely to cause harm, and the types of control measures that we should be designing as well to address that harm. So that's sort of where our regulations are. The way that the Australian legislation is set up is that we have an independent body that's not actually a regulator. It's called Safe Work Australia, and they basically do consultation. So they engage in tripartite consultation to develop what's called the Model Act and regulations. And then from there, each of the states or territories who actually have ownership of health and safety regulation for their jurisdiction will then choose to adopt those Model Act and regulations, and they may make modifications to that. The reason for that was that we did have very varied regulation between the different states and territories, and so for organisations who were operating in multiple jurisdictions, it was very difficult for them. So the intent of the Model Act was to harmonise all of that legislation so that it was consistent throughout the country. We've achieved that to varying degrees. Victoria is the holdout at the moment. They're just carrying on with their own legislation. And so, we've got, I think, the majority of states and territories now have adopted the new psychosocial regulations. We've got 3, I think, that we're still sort of waiting to see where they're going to go with it. So, that's where we're up to with that. But we've certainly seen a really big influx of organisations wanting our support since the regulations have come into force.
Yeah, and I would think also that the community of practice, if you will, or the other folks that you're able to collaborate with, how has that grown? At least outside looking in, it looks like it's not only there in Australia, but just the global, community of folks that are talking about this. I see you all kind of here and there, kind of around the world. Tell me a little bit about, the global community of folks talking about this.
Yeah, like you said, I believe it's growing. There are those OG people who've been talking about this well before it became popular to a degree. But I think there's more people recognising, even those people who are traditionally more, I guess, individually orientated when it comes to mental health practice or coming at it more from a wellbeing perspective, understanding the need to look at mental health in the workplace from a systems lens and thinking about how workplace systems can either help or hinder employee mental health. So we're definitely seeing that there's that growth in understanding, and there's more people who are willing to talk about it, and we're interacting with more and more people through podcasts, the medium of the podcast, and through people just hitting us up on LinkedIn and connecting for a conversation or what have you. So it is it is growing, but we're still finding that there are people who are entering the field and maybe confusing things. So like you said, the common one is psychological safety versus psychological health and safety. And in fact, I see there's a big conference, a safety conference in San Antonio this week that we're recording. And one of the guests that you've had on previously on your podcast actually is doing a presentation on psychological safety is not, in capital letters, psychological health and safety. So we continue to have to educate around that. There's people who, they're trying to get their heads around it, and we're very happy to talk to those people and share our findings and make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of what we're talking about.
Yeah. Anything in the crystal ball about this topic that, either of you, I think this is actually I'm a bit of a futurist, to be quite honest. And I'm always interested in what do you see out there that, that might be a little bit different from what we've seen in the next, month, year or so?
Yeah, well, I think there will be more of a focus on, I guess, understanding, like if we think about burnout as a topic, people have become a lot more interested in burnout, the causes of burnout, how do we actually prevent burnout for the purpose of retention and health promotion. And we've got great people like
yes.
Joe Grasso, who I know you've had on your podcast recently as well. He's a good friend. And, there are people even in the US like Joe and Lyra Health who are really trying to move the conversation away from just purely focus on the individual and more reactive type mental health intervention to how to actually get proactive and think about systems and creating safe systems of work to prevent burnout. So I think we're going to continue to evolve that discussion, looking at my crystal ball around, hey, maybe employee engagement isn't the be-all and end-all. Maybe we need to look at more psychosocial risk management for the purpose of burnout prevention and retention. I guess the other thing, we're working on is tools. So that was the big gap I saw 5 years ago when I started to look at, a technology solution that was required for psychosocial risk management, was that there just wasn't tools to help companies to really consult with staff at scale and understand the extent of the issues and where they needed to prioritize their actions. And so I think there'll be growing acceptance that we need specific tools to consult and manage psychosocial risks as compared to, just using the old employee engagement or culture survey and thinking that's our employee consultation done. So there are a couple for me. There's a few others, but I'll hand over to my esteemed colleague.
What do you think?
So I think that the employer of choice driver is going to become more significant into the future. We've had research conducted here in Australia that says that a workplace that's supportive of and protective of mental health is the second most important factor in somebody accepting a job offer after salary, and is also the second most important thing that will keep somebody in a job longer than they would otherwise stay after salary as well. So this is going to continue to be really important into the future. And so I think even in those areas of the world where there perhaps aren't the same regulatory drivers that we have here in Australia, the employer of choice, the recruitment and the retention drivers are certainly going to be more significant. And all of that comes with the need for better research in this area. And so, that's certainly something that we're trying to do with our platform. And, the more data that we're collecting, and we're able to start to look at predictive relationships and that sort of thing. So, we're going to be working with our clients to continue to evolve the quality of the data analytics that we're able to do to really look at those sort of predictive relationships between people's experience of work and then outcomes, at an individual mental health level, but also at an organisational level, like turnover, like, injury claims, those types of things, absenteeism, etc. So, I think as we get more robust data coming through from not only us, but, there's plenty of people out there who are researching in this space now. As we're getting more robust data, more good quality studies coming through, I think we'll just continue to build the case for why this is important for organisations from a number of different perspectives, and that's just going to continue to grow. And I think, safety is always talking about, well, what's the next step change for safety? And I think that Psych Health and Safety is it. That's a step change in our generation for sure.
I agree wholeheartedly. I really do. I sometimes describe it as the safety imperative of our time is this one, because there are lots of, I think one of you mentioned it earlier, there are a lot of organizations who, because they don't think that, well, they're not handling chemicals and doing heavy construction and that type of thing, they don't think they have hazards at all, but they have this one. They do, because every gathering of human beings has this one. And I think that more folks just need to know. So I want to ask a couple more before we before we bail here. So what's next for the global podcast family? Because it started off with the OG platform, and now we're kind of all over the world here. I mean, anything interesting coming up with, the podcast around the world?
Yeah, Psych Health and Safety Botswana.
No. Had you for a second there.
Yeah, really? No, not really. No, look, I think we're pretty happy with where we're at. So Canada, US, Australia. We did consider having a Psych Health and Safety UK podcast. But instead of doing that, we decided to get a couple of great hosts. So Peter Kelly, who was one of the people behind the original management standards in the UK and had worked at the regulator there for about 25 years as a senior psychologist. And then Hayley Farrell, who works internally in a global role around health and safety with a unique focus around psychosocial risk management. So we got the two of them who complement each other really well. To actually alternate with Joelle and myself on the OG Psych Health and Safety podcast. So, yeah, instead of creating new spin-offs like Psych Health and Safety US, it's more let's, leverage the existing platforms that we've got and the communities that we're creating on those platforms and bring, I guess, new hosts and so therefore new perspectives like we're talking about. Right on.
Well, so for the folks who I think we're up to, oh boy, we're getting close to 1,500 subscribers. I mean, do I believe that those folks are on every week? Probably not, but it seems to be continually growing. And I continue to run across people who are going like, oh yeah, I really enjoyed that last guest you had. And, I'm actually to the point now where I've had people that are reaching out to me say, hey, can I be on? which is a good issue to have. So what would you all say to those of us who are, following in the footsteps? What's the encouragement? What's the pointer that you would give to the advocates here in the U.S. that are trying to see this thing happen and trying to see things get better? Joelle, why don't we start with you on that one?
So I think that there's a few points. You need to really make sure that your approach is sound. So, there are, I think, the thing that we've seen here in Australia with the release of the regulations is that now suddenly there's a whole bunch of providers out there who are claiming to be experts in psych health and safety. And a lot of them aren't actually doing anything different to their previous sort of well-being initiatives, but they're just rebranding. So I would say start with a position of being really informed about what it is that you're looking for. The first step that you need to take is you need to do a really good diagnostic. You need to actually understand what are your hazards and understand what are the organisational drivers and enablers that are sitting behind those hazards. And that will lead you then to looking at, do we need an intervention that we can buy from somebody, or do we need to actually redesign how we're doing work? And most of the time it's going to be that second one. So don't just go out and buy resilience training or buy whatever it is that somebody's trying to sell you to fix the problem. You really need to understand the problem first. You don't go to the doctor and say, oh, give me some medicine, please. You go to the doctor and say, here's my symptoms, what's going on? And so, treat it in that same way. What are the symptoms? And we need to understand what's going on behind those symptoms before we can understand how to treat them.
Wow. Jason, your thoughts?
Yeah, I concur with Joelle regarding, make sure that you're informed to start with. Definitely know the difference between psych safety and psych health and safety before you start offering services. But we are seeing that, right? Like Joelle said, they're not actually changing and taking a risk management approach. They're just rebadging things as that were resilience training to psychosocial resilience training. So psychosocial, I mentioned on LinkedIn the other day, is becoming the new neuro. Just put neuro in front of everything, and then like neuro leadership training program and that sort of thing. So seeing a lot of that. But the other thing, I guess, is it depends on where you're coming from, right? If you're an academic, if you're a practitioner, if you're an internal person as well. I really think if you are an internal role, stop looking at other companies who are demonstrating best practice in the area, because I tell you, they don't exist yet. There are some that have started the journey and very much on the bleeding edge, and therefore, learning through mistakes. I don't think any company has nailed this yet, and there's a lot of companies that come to us saying, "Hey, we want to be the best in this area. Who can we talk to?" And we're like, "Well, hey, there's a lot of things you can take on board, and here's some lessons that you can learn from these other people's mistakes, but there's still a good opportunity to kind of like really lead." And if you're an internal, then look for opportunities where you can, lead, become that leading organization. There's lots of great resources. We put it between you and us. We've put out hundreds of hours of podcast material, so plenty ways to educate yourself. There's free e-learning programs out there. There's lots of people who, if you hit them up on LinkedIn, they'll be very happy for a conversation. But look at what you can do internally to really model what does good psych health and safety look like. And again, a big shout out to Dr. Joe Grasso and Lyra Health. They are taking psychosocial risk management to market in the US to help their clients to be able to do this well, but they are learning from their own experience. They're actually doing it internally with their own people. So, learn those lessons yourself if you can, and then, be a beacon, really shine out to people. This is what good looks like, because we need more examples of that.
Why? I think it was, Gandhi or somebody who said, be the change you want to see in the world. Stop looking around for the change and be it. Just be the change that you certainly want to see. Wow. Well, thanks very much for getting up early in your case. As I've shared, I stay up late anyway, so this is fine. But it's good to see both of you. I am still looking forward to that opportunity someday to be able to meet. I've been, interacting with lots of folks here recently in person that I've known for 2 or 3 years, and they're, "Hey, you're actually a real person." So I do hope to have that happen someday. And as I said, thanks to both of you and to the effort and the support that you give to this podcast to cause it to happen. And when I share with people, there's folks in Australia sponsoring that are, helping us take this journey. We're not certainly taking it alone, but it wouldn't have been possible without your assistance and help and support. I really appreciate it, and I'm eternally in your gratitude for the opportunity to participate. So again, yeah.
No, and David, we couldn't have asked for a better host to lead the US. So thank you so much for that, and shout out to Jack, our podcast producer, who does all of that. Joelle and I have very little to do with the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast, but Jack has a hell of a lot to do with it. So he
does a great job. Does a great job. So it's fun to have conversation with him on the occasions that I do. And but again, my goal is to kind of keep it easy for everybody, because I don't want it to seem like too much work for anybody, including me. So again, just thanks very much, and that'll actually wrap it up. That's a whole year down. First episode, I guess, of the new season, new year, whatever we're going to call it. So if you're watching this episode on the Flourish DX YouTube page, please do like, subscribe, and share. And if you want to watch or listen to this podcast, or if you are watching or listening for the first time, welcome. We love to have you come back in the future. Previous episodes of the podcast can be found at psychhealthandsafetyusa.com. And please become a part of the Psych Health and Safety USA movement by connecting to us on LinkedIn. We are certainly happy to have had the opportunity to be with you for the last little over an hour or so. And we will see you next time on the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast.
Tune in each Friday for new episodes of the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. If you have a story or know of one that needs to be told, reach out to us on LinkedIn or send an email to David at id2-solutions.com or go to the Flourish DX website at flourishdx.com. We'll see you next time.